In the heart of London, right outside the iconic Buckingham Palace, a royal guard stood proudly at his post. Dressed in his traditional red tunic and black bearskin hat, he was the picture of discipline and dedication. Tourists from all over the world flocked to this spot, cameras in hand, eager to capture a moment with these guards, known for their unwavering ability to stay motionless and silent during their hours-long shifts. On this particular sunny afternoon, the area was buzzing with visitors. The guard, a young man named James, had been standing at his post since early morning. Despite the long hours, he never faltered, his face an impassive mask, his eyes staring straight ahead. To him, this wasn't just a job. It was an honor to serve and represent his country in such a historic role. Among the crowd was a group of young tourists, visibly amused by the stoic nature of the guards. They watched in fascination as James, like a statue, didn't react to the buzzing world around him. Whispers and giggles escaped them as they discussed how incredible it was that these guards could just stand so still, seemingly unaffected by the noise and the constant attention. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd thinned out a bit, but the group of tourists stayed behind, their minds ticking with mischief. They couldn't believe that nothing seemed to disturb the guards and joked about testing their limits. "Do you think he would notice if someone actually touched him?" one of them asked, only half serious. Another responded with a smirk, suggesting they should try something more dramatic, just for a laugh. The idea quickly spiraled into a daring challenge among them. Meanwhile, James remained steadfast at his post, his gaze fixed. Inside, he was alert to everything around him, trained to maintain composure no matter what happened. It was part of the job to handle distractions with grace. Though most days, the job required nothing more than standing still and looking imposing. The tourists, now with a plan in mind, began to circle around him, their voices low. They believed their prank would be harmless, just a bit of fun to add to their travel tales. Little did they know, their actions would soon escalate into an event that would capture the attention of more than just their social media followers. As they prepared to put their plan into motion, a few other bystanders noticed the unusual interest in the guard and began to watch, curious about what was about to unfold. As the group of tourists huddled together, whispering and chuckling, they couldn't take their eyes off James, the royal guard standing motionless by the palace gates. Their plan was simple yet bold, to tie James to the pole next to his post as a prank. They thought it would be hilarious to see if he would maintain his famous composure even then. The leader of the group, a tall guy with a playful glint in his eye, pulled a harmless-looking silk scarf from his backpack. "This will do the trick," he said with a grin, waving the scarf to his friends. The others nodded, their faces lighting up with excitement and a bit of nervous anticipation. They had never done anything like this before, and the thrill of doing something so audacious in such a formal setting added to their adrenaline. As they approached James, they acted casually, blending in with other tourists, taking photos and chatting loudly. One of them, a girl with bright red hair, pretended to pose for a picture beside the guard, giving the others the chance to sneak behind him. The tourists around them were too engrossed in their own sightseeing to notice the mischief unfolding. With a swift and gentle motion, the guy with the scarf managed to loop it around James' waist and the pole. The group worked quickly, their movements synchronized and silent. In seconds, the deed was done. James was loosely tied to the pole, the silk scarf a stark contrast to his dark, formal uniform. The moment the scarf was secured, the group stepped back, their faces a mixture of amusement and shock at their own daring. They expected James to react, to break his pose and confront them, but he did nothing. He stood as still as ever, his expression unchanged. This reaction, or lack of it, only fueled their excitement. They burst into quiet laughter, amazed that they had managed to pull off their prank without any reaction from the guard. Meanwhile, other tourists began to notice the unusual scene. Some found it funny and started taking videos, thinking it was all part of a street performance. Others were confused, unsure if they were witnessing a disrespectful act or a sanctioned part of the guards' routine. As the reality of what they had done began to sink in, the group of pranksters started to feel the weight of their actions. The laughter faded, replaced by a growing sense of worry. They had intended it as a harmless joke, not expecting to cause any real trouble or disrespect to the guard or the traditions he represented. Realizing that things might get serious, they discussed among themselves whether they should untie the scarf before anyone else took action. However, their debate was cut short as an observant bystander, who had been watching the whole event unfold with disapproval, decided it was time to step in and call for help. As the tourists stood around James, who was now tied to the pole, the mood amongst them started to shift. While the initial thrill of their prank lingered, a few began whispering doubts about whether they had gone too far. "He hasn't moved at all. Do you think he's okay?" one concerned girl asked, her voice barely a whisper as she glanced nervously at James' impassive face. The crowd around them continued to grow, with many unaware of how the situation had unfolded. Cameras flashed, and several people laughed, assuming it was all part of a performance. Others, however, didn't find it amusing. They frowned, whispering among themselves about the disrespect shown to a royal guard. One particular bystander, a middle-aged man with a keen sense of duty, felt a strong disapproval watching the scene. With a furrowed brow, he pulled out his phone and dialed the local police, explaining what he'd witnessed. "Yes, a guard at Buckingham Palace. He's been tied up by some tourists. It looks like a joke, but it's very disrespectful," he reported, his voice firm and concerned. Meanwhile, James continued to stand at his post, the very image of discipline. Inside, however, his mind was racing. Trained for almost any disturbance, he found himself in a predicament he had never imagined. The silk scarf was tied in such a manner that it didn't restrain him painfully, but protocol and his own professional pride kept him from reacting outwardly. He focused on his duty, waiting for the appropriate authorities to handle the situation. Back in the group of tourists, a debate erupted. "We should just untie him and apologize," one suggested, her fun fading into worry. "No, let's just leave it. It's just a joke," another countered, unsure of how to back down from the situation they had created. As the discussion continued, more of the onlookers began to take notice of the moral implications of the prank. A few tourists started questioning the pranksters. "Why would you do that? He's just doing his job." These confrontations added to the tension, making the pranksters realize that their harmless joke might have serious consequences, just as the group decided to step forward and undo their prank. The sound of sirens pierced the air. The crowd's attention shifted as police cars pulled up, followed closely by a van bearing the insignia of the Royal Guard. The arrival of the authorities signaled a swift end to the uncertainty. Officers and additional guards swiftly moved through the crowd, their presence bringing a sense of seriousness to the scene. As the new guards approached, their expressions stern and professional, the reality of the situation sank in for everyone involved. The prank had escalated far beyond a simple joke, and now they faced the consequences of their actions in front of a crowd that had mixed reactions, from amusement to disapproval. This was no longer a laughing matter. The moment the sirens blared through the air, the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace shifted. Laughter and murmurs turned into whispers of concern as a squad of royal guards, along with police officers, approached the scene with a sense of urgency. The tourists who had played the prank exchanged nervous glances, their excitement now replaced with unease. James, still standing firm despite the silk scarf around him, remained composed. His training had taught him to endure all kinds of situations without reaction, but he knew that now his fellow guards would handle the matter. The approaching squad was a sight to behold, each guard moving with precision, their expressions unreadable. Unlike the tourists, they did not hesitate or waste a second. One of the officers stepped forward, his eyes scanning the crowd before locking onto the group of tourists. "Who tied the guard to the pole?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The tourists hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. Some looked at the ground, while others glanced at each other, silently hoping someone else would take responsibility. Finally, the tall guy who had led the prank took a deep breath and raised his hand slightly. "It was meant to be a joke," he admitted, his voice quieter than before. The officer sighed, clearly unimpressed. "A joke? You think tying a royal guard to a pole in front of Buckingham Palace is a joke?" His voice was not angry, but it carried a weight that made the tourists feel even smaller. Before any of them could answer, two guards moved forward and, with swift efficiency, untied the silk scarf. James, once freed, gave a single nod to his fellow guards, a silent acknowledgement of their arrival. Even after everything, he remained expressionless, a true professional. The gathered crowd, now witnessing a real-life consequence of the prank, watched with bated breath. Some people muttered disapproval toward the tourists, while others recorded the event, knowing it would soon make headlines. The officer turned back to the tourists. "You do realize this could be considered an act of interference with a military service member. This is not just fun and games." His words hit hard, making the pranksters' stomachs churn with regret. One of the girls stepped forward, her voice shaking. "We're really sorry. We didn't mean any harm. We just thought he wouldn't react, and it would be funny." The officer shook his head. "The guards are trained not to react. That doesn't give anyone the right to test their limits or humiliate them." A few of the onlookers nodded in agreement. The gravity of the situation was settling in for the pranksters, and the reality of what they had done became clear. As the guards stepped back into formation, the police officers began discussing the next steps, leaving the tourists in suspense about what would happen next. Whatever the outcome, one thing was certain: this was a mistake they would never forget. The air around Buckingham Palace felt heavier as the police officers and royal guards stood before the group of tourists. The once laughing pranksters now shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their actions. The playful energy they had felt earlier had vanished, replaced by a growing sense of regret. The reality was clear. This wasn't just a harmless joke anymore. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a strong build and a serious expression, took a step forward. His voice was calm but firm. "Do you realize what you've done? This isn't just about playing a prank. You interfered with an official duty, and that is a serious matter." His sharp gaze moved across each of the tourists, making them lower their heads. The tall guy, who had led the prank, swallowed hard. "We didn't mean any harm," he repeated, his voice quieter than before. We thought it would just be funny." The officer sighed, shaking his head. "This is a royal guard standing at one of the most important landmarks in the country. Their job is not a joke. What if someone had done something worse? What if this distraction had led to a real security threat?" His words made the situation feel even heavier. James, the guard who had been tied, remained silent, his disciplined posture unshaken. Even though he had been the center of the prank, he did not show any sign of anger or frustration. His training had prepared him for moments like this, to remain still, to endure, to uphold the honor of his position. But the respect of his fellow guards was clear in their sharp gazes toward the pranksters. A woman in the crowd, who had been watching the whole time, crossed her arms and muttered, "They should have thought about that before pulling such a stunt." A few others nodded in agreement, whispering about how embarrassing it was to see visitors disrespecting such an important tradition. The lead officer exhaled and then turned to the group again. "If this were taken to the highest authority, you'd be facing serious consequences. But since no real harm was done, we're giving you a choice. You can either come with us for questioning, or you can apologize properly and understand why what you did was wrong." The tourists exchanged nervous glances. They knew there was only one right choice. The red-haired girl stepped forward, her voice full of guilt. "We're really sorry," she said sincerely, looking at James. "We disrespected you, your job, and this place. We shouldn't have done it." One by one, The others followed, each apologizing with lowered heads. James didn't move, but his fellow guards gave small nods of approval. The officer finally spoke again. "Good. Let this be a lesson. Not everything is for entertainment. Respect matters." With that, the tension in the air began to ease, but the embarrassment on the tourists' faces remained. This would be a story they would never forget, but not for the reasons they had intended. The atmosphere remained tense as the tourists stood before the police officers and royal guards, their faces filled with guilt. The realization of their mistake weighed heavily on them. What had started as a silly prank had turned into a moment of deep embarrassment, not just for themselves but for everyone watching. They had disrespected a long-standing tradition, and now they were forced to confront the consequences. James, the guard they had tied up, remained as still as ever. His discipline was unshaken, his expression unreadable. To an outsider, it might seem like he didn't care, but those who knew the royal guards understood that this was a sign of professionalism. No matter what happened, they upheld their duty with dignity. The officer who had been leading the conversation took one last look at the group. "You've apologized, but you need to understand something," he said firmly. "People from all over the world visit this place, and the royal guards represent more than just security. They are a symbol of discipline, history, and honor. When you treat them like a joke, you're disrespecting more than just one person. You're disrespecting an entire institution." The words hit hard. The tourists lowered their heads even more, feeling the weight of their actions. Some of the bystanders who had been watching nodded in agreement, while others murmured about how lucky the group was to be let off with just a warning. One of the younger tourists, who had been quieter than the rest, finally spoke up. "We really didn't think about it that way," he admitted. "We just saw the videos online of people trying to make the guards react, and we thought it would be funny to push it a little further. But we get it now. It wasn't funny. It was wrong." The officer nodded. That's the problem with these so-called challenges online. People see a few seconds of a video and think they can do anything for entertainment without considering the consequences. James' fellow guards stood in formation, their presence alone enough to remind everyone of the importance of their role. There was a silent understanding between them. This was not the first time tourists had tested a guard's patience, and it wouldn't be the last. But today, the lesson had been made clear. The officer sighed, then finally made his decision. "We won't take this further, but let this be a lesson you never forget. If you truly respect what these men do, then share this experience. Let others know that some things shouldn't be turned into a joke." The tourists nodded eagerly, relieved that they wouldn't be facing more severe consequences. As they slowly stepped back, blending into the crowd once more, they realized that their time in London would be remembered for a very different reason than they had planned. The guards resumed their positions, the crowd slowly dispersing. But for the tourists, this moment would linger in their minds for a long time, a reminder that some traditions deserve respect, no matter how still or silent they may seem. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the tourists who had played the prank lingered for a moment, still feeling the weight of their mistake. The police officers had let them go with a stern warning, but the lesson they had learned would stay with them forever. The excitement they had once felt was gone, replaced by a deep sense of embarrassment. They had come to London for fun, but instead they had become an example of what not to do. James, the royal guard at the center of it all, remained as still as ever. His posture never wavered, his expression unchanged. Even after being tied to the pole as part of a prank, he had not broken his discipline. His fellow guards respected him even more for this, and though they did not speak, a silent acknowledgement passed between them. One of the tourists, the red-haired girl, turned back for a final glance at James before leaving. She wondered what he was thinking. Did he feel angry, embarrassed, or was he simply following his training, unaffected by what had happened? There was no way to know. The royal guards were known for their ability to remain calm no matter what, and James had proven that today. As they walked away from Buckingham Palace, the group talked quietly amongst themselves. I still can't believe we did that, one of them muttered, shaking his head. It seemed funny at the time, but looking back, it was just dumb. The tall guy, who had led the prank, let out a deep breath. Yeah, I feel like an idiot. We didn't mean to be disrespectful, but that's exactly what we were. The red-haired girl nodded. I guess we got caught up in the moment. But the way the officers talked about the guards, it really made me see things differently. These men aren't just standing there for fun. They're part of something bigger. They all fell into a thoughtful silence as they continued walking. The world around them carried on as usual. Tourists chatting, buses passing, the city buzzing with life. But for them, this day had changed something. They had seen firsthand what it meant to disrespect a tradition, and they had been lucky to escape without harsher consequences. One of them pulled out their phone and hesitated before speaking. Maybe we should post about this, he suggested. Not to brag about what we did, but to tell people not to do the same. Maybe someone else will learn from our mistake. The others agreed. They had wanted attention for their prank, but now they wanted to use that attention to spread a different message, one of respect and understanding. As they left Buckingham Palace behind, they knew they would never forget what had happened. The experience had changed them in ways they hadn't expected. It had started as a joke, but in the end, it had become a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. As the day drew to a close, the group of tourists continued to reflect on their actions, feeling a mix of regret and newfound understanding. They had walked away from Buckingham Palace that afternoon, but the lessons they had learned stayed with them. It wasn't just about the prank anymore. It was about the respect for tradition, the importance of understanding other people's roles, and how easy it is to make a mistake when you don't fully appreciate what's at stake. Back in their hotel, they gathered around a table, the quiet chatter among them serving as the backdrop for their thoughts. The red-haired girl pulled out her phone and hesitated for a moment, remembering how they had wanted attention for their prank earlier in the day. Now, their intentions had shifted. They weren't looking for recognition anymore. They wanted to make things right. We need to tell people what we learned, she said, looking around the table. This wasn't just a silly joke. It was a reminder that there's a reason people do things the way they do, and it's not for us to disrespect. The others nodded in agreement. The tall guy, who at first suggested the prank, added, I think we all know now. The royal guards aren't part of some show. They're representing something much bigger. I never really understood that before, but I do now. It's not something you can just joke about. They spent the next few hours crafting a message. It wasn't about defending themselves or making excuses. It was simply an apology, an honest reflection of their mistake, shared in the hope that others would learn from it. They talked about how their harmless fun had quickly turned into something more serious, and how the actions of one group of tourists had affected not just the royal guards, but the hundreds of people who witnessed what happened. The post went live that evening, with each of them sharing their experience on social media. As the hours passed, comments started coming in. Some people were supportive, thanking them for owning up to their mistake and acknowledging the importance of respect. Others, of course, were critical, but the tourists didn't mind. They knew they had done the right thing, even if it meant facing some negative reactions. The story didn't end there. In the days that followed, they received messages from people around the world, some offering their understanding, while others took the opportunity to share their own experiences with the royal guards. It sparked conversations about how tradition should be honored and the importance of not taking such iconic symbols of history for granted. For the tourists, the experience changed the way they saw not only Buckingham Palace, but also the people who dedicated themselves to protecting it. They'd walked in with a sense of adventure and a desire to have fun, but they left with something far more valuable, a deeper respect for the role that tradition and discipline play in society. When they returned home, the lesson remained in their hearts. Every time they told the story of what happened that day, they emphasized the importance of respect. The incident had been embarrassing, yes, But it had also been a turning point, a reminder that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected places. And while the prank may have been forgotten by most, the tourists would never forget the lesson they learned that day in front of Buckingham Palace. They would carry it with them for the rest of their lives, ensuring that their future travels would be filled with a newfound sense of respect and understanding.